On March 18, 2018, an Uber test vehicle moved through Tempe, Arizona, in automated mode. Rafaela Vasquez sat behind the wheel as the human safety driver. The vehicle struck pedestrian Elaine Herzberg, and Herzberg was killed. After the collision, Uber suspended its self-driving vehicle testing in Arizona. The scene contains a machine, a driver, a pedestrian, and a death. But it also contains a more difficult question. Should the outcome of an act transform how much blame we assign for the failure that preceded it? Suppose the safety driver had failed to monitor the road in precisely the same way, but no pedestrian had entered the vehicle's path. There would still be a failure of attention. There might still be grounds for criticism. Yet it is hard to deny that the actual death changes the moral atmosphere of the case. A lapse becomes the lapse that ended a life. That difference matters because outcomes are never fully in our hands. Attention can fail. A system can be inadequate. A person can enter a road at a particular moment. Events meet, and only afterward do we see a tragedy as if it had been waiting to happen. The Tempe collision, therefore, does not only ask who caused harm. It asks whether harm itself can deepen guilt, even when the difference between disaster and non-disaster depended partly on circumstances no one controlled. Thomas Nagel's account of moral luck begins exactly where this unease begins, with the gap between what we think people should be judged for and how we actually judge them. Thomas Nagel published Mortal Questions in 1979. In the essay Moral Luck, collected in that book, he examines attention at the center of moral assessment. We want a responsibility to track control. Yet our judgments repeatedly track outcomes as well. The control principle says that a person should not be morally assessed for what lies beyond that person's control. It has an immediate appeal. If an event was not up to me, then it seems unfair to praise or blame me for it. Moral judgment should concern my choices, my intentions, my care or carelessness. It should not depend on the stray movements of the world around me. But Nagel argues that ordinary moral judgment repeatedly violates this principle. We do not merely ask whether someone acted carelessly. We ask what their carelessness caused. We do not merely consider an intention in isolation. We consider the life it entered, the situation it confronted, and the consequences that followed. This creates a conflict that cannot be solved simply by choosing one side. If we judge only what agents controlled, much of our ordinary language of guilt begins to look mistaken. If we judge people by outcomes, we seem to hold them responsible for luck. The Tempe crash gives that conflict a concrete form. A human safety driver was present. The vehicle was operating in automated mode. A pedestrian was killed. Each fact invites moral judgment, but none tells us by itself how to measure blame. The strongest objection to Nagel's argument, developed later by Michael Zimmerman, is that unequal outcomes may leave equal culpability intact. Nagel's next example shows why that objection has such force, and why ordinary judgment resists it. Nagel uses the case of a truck driver whose negligence is slight. Perhaps the driver has not been as careful as he should have been. Then a child suddenly enters the road. If the child is killed, the driver may be blamed in a way that another, equally negligent but luckier driver is not. The fault in the two drivers may be the same. Their degree of carelessness may be the same. What differs is what happens afterward. One driver reaches home with nothing more than an unrecognized failure behind him. The other has killed a child. Nagel calls this resultant luck. Luck in the consequences of an action. It is luck because the result depends partly on factors beyond the agent's control. The child's entry into the road is not chosen by the driver, yet the result transforms the moral description we are inclined to give. The driver who kills is not merely negligent in our eyes. He is the driver whose negligence killed. Nagel also identifies constitutive luck, which concerns the kind of person one is, circumstantial luck, which concerns the situations one faces, and causal luck, which concerns the prior conditions that shape what one does. These forms widen the problem. We do not choose our dispositions completely. We do not choose every moral test we encounter. We do not choose all the causes that produce our actions. Resultant luck is still the sharpest case because it seems so visible. The act is complete. The fault may be fixed. Then the world adds a consequence. We respond as though the person has become more blameworthy. This is not merely an error in emotional intensity. It may be built into what we mean by responsibility. A death demands explanation, repair, punishment, and regret in ways a near miss does not. The question is whether those demands show that guilt has changed, or only that the world now contains a harm that must be answered for. That distinction is the point at which Kantian ethics separates the worth of a will from the damage an action leaves behind. In Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, published in 1785, Immanuel Kant argues that moral worth depends on acting from duty, rather than on successful outcomes. Duty means acting because an action is morally required, not because it happens to produce a desired result. For Kant, a good will retains its moral value even when circumstances prevent it from achieving its aim. The moral quality of the will does not rise and fall with success. A person who acts from duty and fails through bad circumstances has not become less morally worthy because the world resisted the action. Applied to negligence, the Kantian thought is not that outcomes are unimportant. Death is not made morally trivial because it was partly a matter of luck, but consequences do not automatically reveal a deeper defect in the will. If two drivers were equally negligent, a Kantian has reason to say that their moral fault is equal, even if only one causes a death. This allows for an important separation. Harm can change what must be repaired. It can change what compensation is owed. It can change what a legal system must address. But bad luck alone need not increase moral guilt. That answer is disciplined, perhaps even severe. It refuses to let the horror of an outcome silently rewrite the moral status of the choice that preceded it. Yet it also risks sounding detached from the person harmed. If a child has died, or if Elaine Herzberg has died, saying that the driver's inner fault was unchanged can feel like a refusal to acknowledge what has happened. The stronger challenge, however, is more precise than that emotional protest. Zimmerman argues that equal fault remains equal even when the results are radically unequal. Michael Zimmerman defends a control-based account of moral responsibility in Luck and Moral Responsibility, published in 1987. His position presses directly against resultant moral luck. People cannot be morally responsible for outcomes that depend on factors beyond their control. On Zimmerman's view, the two negligent drivers have the same degree of moral responsibility. One driver causes a death, the other does not. But the difference comes from circumstances outside their control. Whether a child enters the road, whether contact occurs, whether the negligent act reaches a fatal result. Those differences can change the world. They cannot change the degree of culpability already present in the drivers. This is the strongest resistance because it preserves the control principle without denying the reality of harm. Zimmerman does not need to say that death is insignificant. He can say that death matters enormously while denying that it makes the driver morally worse than an equally negligent driver who was lucky. The objection forces several distinctions that are often compressed into one word: blame. Moral blame concerns the agent's culpability. Legal liability concerns what the law assigns. Compensation concerns what is owed for harm. Emotional regret concerns the proper human response to a terrible result. These can move together, but they do not have to be identical. A driver who causes a death may owe compensation in a way a lucky driver does not. Legal liability may differ because actual harm differs. Regret may be profound because a life has been lost. None of that establishes that the unlucky driver had a worse will or a greater degree of moral fault. But there is a problem with this argument. The Tempe crash does not present a simple comparison between two isolated drivers with the same slight negligence. It distributes causal failure across a safety driver, a vehicle system, and a corporate process. The National Transportation Safety Board issued its final report on the Tempe Uber crash in November 2019. The board found that the safety driver's failure to monitor the driving environment was the probable cause of the crash. It also identified Uber's inadequate safety risk assessment procedures as a contributing factor. The vehicle's automatic emergency braking capability was disabled during automated operation. That fact matters because it places the crash within a system of design and safety decisions, not solely within a single moment of human inattention. A human safety driver was responsible for monitoring the environment, but the vehicle system was operating under conditions shaped by Uber's procedures. In 2023, Rafaela Vázquez pleaded guilty to a charge of endangerment arising from the crash. That legal event does not settle the philosophical problem. A guilty plea concerns a charge. It does not tell us whether the moral blame attached to a failure of monitoring is measured by the death that occurred, by the failure itself, or by the larger system in which that failure took place. Nagel helps explain why the death seems inseparable from blame. The actual result changes our moral vision. Kant and Zimmerman answer that the outcome may change duties of repair, legal consequences, and regret without changing the moral quality of the will or the degree of culpability. The autonomous vehicle makes the dispute harder, not easier, when a crash involves a human safety driver, disabled emergency braking, and inadequate safety risk assessment. The question is no longer simply whether one person was unlucky. It is whether moral judgment can isolate a single will at all when failure has been organized across people and systems. Elaine Herzberg's death remains a concrete harm, not a philosophical illustration. Yet the case leaves a precise open question. When a system distributes causal failure, should blame follow control, outcome, or the connections between them? Subscribe for more philosophy grounded in the cases that shape public life.